March 31st, 1985. Madison Square Garden, New York. The first ever WrestleMania is taking place. The main event is currently happening. It is a multi-person tag match featuring Mr. T, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff, Cowboy Bob Orton, and the two men of the hour, Roddy Piper and Hulk Hogan. Why were these two men chosen to be in the main event of the inaugural Showcase of the Immortals? Well, let's roll it back with a rewind. Alright, so before we get started, just for full disclosure, I was barely alive when all of this was taking place. I was born in the last half of 1984. So I don't necessarily have firsthand experience of being able to witness and be enveloped in all these emotions live and in real time. I, of course, had to go back and watch it 30, 40 years after it happened. What I can tell you is the emotions are very palpable. To really understand where we were in 1984 and 1985, you have to have at least a novice's understanding of what professional wrestling was early in the mid-'80s. Since wrestling promotions had started, at least stateside, they ran on a territory system. A different promotion would cover a different region, like Mid-Atlantic or Mid-South, or Portland in the Pacific Northwest, which we will be talking about when it comes to Roddy Piper. And there was a gentleman's agreement with all the promoters that you would not infringe on talent. There was sort of a, the talent are still to this day independent contractors. They don't have W-2s. And back in the day in the territories, you would work a territory for a couple months and then go on to a new territory. It kept characters fresh. It kept, honestly, feuds going for prolonged periods of time, and you're able to come into a territory, start a feud, maybe build it up, blow it off, or build it up, leave and come back, and then blow it off. So going into the 80s, Vince McMahon, as we know him today, is Vince Jr., and his dad owns the company at the time, the WWF. Vince buys the company from his dad and promptly starts reneging on the gentleman's agreement and buying up talent, and quickly promotions are going under. The reasoning behind this from all sides is money. Back in the territory days, you weren't reliant on national TV contracts. There wasn't any national TV. The TV back in the 70s and 80s, if you didn't live during those decades, hell, I would say into a good portion of the 90s as well, we had regional, cable providers at best. The territories need the local revenue of the house show circuit that is not necessarily untelevised shows, but shows that aren't televised live. They're reliant on ticket sales and people showing up and getting a cut of concession stands, probably. For Vince, he saw the money in taking the product national and international, as we would see. It was a big risk. He put everything on the line to make that happen, and if for all of his personal faults, I will give one slight tip of the hat to Vince for putting it all out on the line for his company, and in this case, WrestleMania 1, and we all get to reap the benefits of that down the road. Is he a scumbag on a personal level? Absolutely. Professionally, back in 84 and 85, I'm going to give him an A+. And in order for him to make this big, ginormous push happens, he has to have not only top talent, but he has to be able to cross over somehow. Luckily for Vince at this time and over the few years preceding what would be WrestleMania 1, a new TV channel was created that was mostly directed towards the youth population. It was called MTV, and they played this newfangled thing called a music video. This was a potential golden goose for anyone who could really latch on to the youth. This hadn't happened before. A lot of the companies had sort of missed out on capitalizing on counterculture in the 60s in much the same way that they would end up being able to in the 80s and 90s, and a lot of that has to do with the advent of MTV and the MTV generation that came along with it. Minds that were ready to be shaped and not to say manipulated in a negative way, but manipulated in such a way from companies where you could maybe convince them that wrestling was cool. BS, wrestling is really cool. Being able to cross over into the mainstream would guarantee better ad revenue, better sponsorship opportunities, more eyes on the product. These are all great things. And in order to do that, Vince is going to need to insanely over popular in both positive and negative ways top talent in order to build a program around. And this all happens in very, very short order. This isn't a long play. This is the first stick of dynamite that starts this process of international takeover from the WWE. One side of the equation is, of course, going to be Hulk Hogan, which at this point almost goes without any type of bio breakdown. But you have to understand where we are in 1985. So coming into this, Hulk isn't Hulkamania. It starts here. Gorilla Monsoon is often, and I would attribute him to be accredited with coming up with the Hulkamania tagline. But before this, Hulk is, in and out of the WWF. He actually was employed at one point, and he was fired because he took the role as Thunderlips in Rocky 3. I was personally fond of his feud in the AWA with Nick Bockwinkel, which was what he was doing right going into WWF. That was a masterclass in storytelling, not a long-term feud by any means, sort of like with this one, but something that was beautiful and will definitely deserve a deep dive at some point. And also, too, he has a storied early history in Japan wrestling for New Japan Pro and Antonio Inoki. In Japan, he's known as Ichiban, which means number one in Japanese. He wrestles a distinctly different style in Japan. It is much more technical. He uses a different finisher, actually. It's called the Axe Bomber, which is a crooked arm lariat. It looks brutal in the early 80s. It would probably still work nowadays. Why he didn't do all this stateside, years later, he simply said he didn't have to. You hulk up, hit the leg drop, big boot, 1, 2, 3, go home. But anyway, I digress. At this time, Hulk was the quintessential real American. He was freaking massive, 6'7", very muscular. He took a lot of vitamins that I'm sure were prescribed by an accredited doctor, and he was saying his prayers, and he was frankly over like Rover. He had cartoons and TV shows and movies, most of them god awful. But all that still happened. Hulk was freaking massive. They were riding the edge of a lightning bolt with the type of talent this guy had and the type of pull that he had on the audience, especially people like the younger audience, the young kids, that slice of the pie chart that you need for that true crossover appeal. It should be important to note, too, that at this time in the 80s, we were still in the Cold War. It was starting to wane down a little bit, but a certain brand of American exceptionalism was always going to sort of get over with a crowd in a state like this, and Hulk was that type of person. Granted, his opponent in Roddy Piper wasn't your quote-unquote, atypical communist, but we had plenty of the evil foreigners happening, not necessarily in WWF, but all over professional wrestling. We had Iron Sheik, Nikita Koloff, just to name a few, that were the quintessential, bad, un-American, foreign, heel, bad guy trope. Thankfully, Roddy didn't embrace that image at all. In fact, if anything, Roddy sort of played the role as the out-of-touch older generation. You need someone who is not necessarily feared, but you need someone whose ass you would love to see get kicked. At this time, bottom line, it's easy to say top 3 Roddy Piper of all time as far as heels go, but at the time, there wouldn't be anybody really similar, and this does sort of create an interesting dichotomy. Piper is much smaller than Hulk. He's about 5 inches shorter and, 50 to 80, 100 pounds lighter in the muscle department. What Piper does have is a mouth. He is Deadpool in wrestling form. Roddy Piper is hilarious and scathing at the same time. During his time with the WWE, he has a segment called Piper's Pit. Most of the time, he just uses it to shit talk people, and it's great. Famously, he does hit Jimmy Superfly Snuka in the head with a coconut, which is racist. He also does get into a little scuffle with Bruno. They have a Hell in a Cell match in '86 to blow that off, but that's a story for a different day. But Piper uses his Piper's Pit segment to infuriate crowds all across the nation. And he is just a maven as far as wordsmithing goes. He has the gift of gab. He knows what to say to get under people's skin. And most importantly, he hates the whole mainstream, what would be come to be known as the rock and wrestling connection. He doesn't like that crossover appeal. On a real, very real shoot level, he doesn't like it. He likes to keep his wrestling and his entertainment separate, which is sort of funny because he did act in quite a few movies. But he didn't want to see the wholesomeness, I don't think. He wanted something more gritty and visceral. And especially when you're talking about some of their players involved. How this really gets started is America's sweetheart and one of my first personal crushes, Cyndi Lauper, has a little song you might know of. It's called Girls Just Want to Have Fun. In the music video for that, professional wrestler Captain Lou Albano plays her dad. And little known fact, but that song went out to be relatively popular. Little side note, for those of you who don't know Captain Lou Albano, if you remember the short-lived 1989 Mario live-action show, he was Mario. Side note, the actor who played Luigi in the 1989 live-action Mario was Charlie the bartender on The Jeffersons. Anyway, back to the first crush of my life, Cyndi Lauper. She had a really big hit, Girls Just Want to Have Fun. She shows up on December 28th, 1984, to present an award to Lou Albano. And who shows up to ruin this? Freaking Roddy Piper. He attacks Lou Albano, he kicks Cyndi Lauper, which, if Roddy was still around, I'd probably slap him in the mouth for, because that's just uncalled for. And Hogan comes in to make the save. This is where the feud starts. And our feud, as far as calendar length and amount of matches goes, it's very, very short. 2 matches. That's not to say that this isn't a worthwhile feud. For Christ's teeth, this is building up to the main event of WrestleMania, and we're doing this in about a month. Now, one thing that does take a little bit longer than a month is really building this rock and wrestling connection that Vince and MTV are trying to propel really each other into the mainstream consciousness. They accomplish this by having a couple events. The first one is the Brawl That Ended All, which takes place July 23rd of 1984. Hogan is going to retain his title versus Greg Valentine, who is severely underrated. The match that we're really going to focus on is the War to Settle the Score, which takes place February 15th, 1985, out of Madison Square Garden in New York. Hulk is going to win via DQ-ish. Roddy sort of throws him into the ref, and after that, all hell breaks loose. During the match, Paul Orndorff and Bob Orton Jr. both tried to interfere, and, well, like I said, the wheels come off this train, so to speak, very, very quickly. Mr. T and Cyndi Lauper also both get attacked by Piper, which is what's going to be setting up WrestleMania. The real travesty in trying to research this is the Brawl to End It All and the War to Settle the Score. Neither one are on Peacock, or, as far as I can tell, are on the WWE network if you're outside the United States. I had to find the chopped up into 2 and 3 parts version on various video hosting platforms in order to watch that. The War to Settle the Score and Brawl to End It All, specifically. It's really sort of a bummer, but I know stuff gets complicated when you're talking about different companies and corporations working with each other. I can sort of get it. Part of what makes this era so much fun is the fact that we are trying to invoke a lot of pomp and circumstance, and we certainly see that at WrestleMania 1, which you can definitely check out on the WWE Network / Peacock, and you definitely should. What a lot of fans of a certain age, and I am of a certain age, don't realize is wrestlers didn't used to have entrances. Even in the mid-'80s, this was still a relatively new thing. So the entire pomp and circumstance, from Roddy coming out with a army of bagpipes leading him, to Hulk and Mr. T being shown in the tunnel beforehand, doing the cross and saying their prayers before they come out to this huge ovation. It was something that had never been seen on such a grandiose scale before. And they had one chance to hit it out of the park, and you need to go back and watch it. The match itself, of course, by today's standards, it's doesn't necessarily hold up. Personally, I was laughing the whole time out of just sheer joy. It was a lot of fun to watch, and just knowing the history between everybody involved was just phenomenal to watch it unfold. And of course, it's going to be a tag match. It's not a singles match. It's Hogan and Mr. T. They're going to be accompanied with Jimmy Superfly Snuka. They're going to be battling Rowdy Roddy Piper and Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. Cowboy Bob Orton is going to be along there with them. Muhammad Ali is the special guest referee. He dips like midway through because he just sort of can't handle it anymore, and he starts taking swings. So Pat Patterson comes and freaking love Pat. And the match is just super fun. Hogan pins Orndorff, lasts about 20-ish minutes, a lot of shenanigans. At the end of the match, just once again completely falls apart. That's one of the things that makes moments like this and feuds like this, even if they're sort of a mini-ish feud, so great, is it can be a little messy at times, but life's messy, and as long as the payoff is worth all the cleanup that you have to deal with, then ultimately anything's sort of worth it if you think about it that way. And this certainly fits that bill. It is important to note, and this is a sort of juicy little nugget just for the whole feud, at least with these two matches. We don't ever see Piper really get his comeuppance. In this match, Paul Orndorff is going to eat the pin from Hulk in both this match and the War to Settle the Score. Piper doesn't get pinned. He does eat some offense, but he doesn't really give the crowd the true closure they want. However, the emotions are so high. This guy is such a trash talker, and his friends are behind him every step of the way, that just to see somebody get punched in the face, somebody eat the big boot, to see somebody eat the leg drop, and somebody eat the 1, 2, 3 is really all that needed to happen in that moment. What takes it to the next level are all the segments in Piper's Pit, where he's building the heat with the audience, where he's demeaning people, where he's literally just treating them like pieces of dirt and making them feel intellectually inferior. And on the other side, you have Hogan, who is really riding this wave of Americana coming out of the waning stages of the Cold War. And it was just a confluence of factors paired with this bubble of pro wrestling going from territorial to national, where all these gears need to line up in order for this to be a home run. We could still hit a double if you don't have the right bad guy or group of bad guys for Hogan to beat, if we can use a baseball analogy. But to hit that grand slam, you had to have the golden hero in Hulk. You had to have the smarmy, sniveling bad guy in Piper. You had to have one of the cutest people ever in Cyndi Lauper, and Mr. T, Mr. T is pretty cool too. And that MTV generation that was just booming. All of this leads to not only the overwhelming success of WrestleMania 1, which is now taken us 40 years to get to what's going to be happening in a couple weeks. None of this would have happened without all the people involved. it would have been far less enjoyable if Hulk and Piper weren't the pro and antagonist of this story. Anyway, for this week, that's the Feud Rewind. Once again, if you have any comments, questions, let me know. Email is feudrewind@gmail.com. You can send me a DM or a public comment on any of the social media platforms if you'd like to. And I will be back next week. My name is Ben Z. Lance, and this is the Feud Rewind. Thank you.